So we're going to talk about self-constructed assets. And what's a self-constructed asset? Well, if you think about Target, they can either go out and buy a building to put their store in, or they can build their own store. A self-constructed asset is if Target decides to build its own store, or Caterpillar decides to build its own factory and act as the general contractor. So when a company just buys a building or a warehouse or whatever, there's a purchase and sale agreement that has a price on it, they get it ready for its intended use, and that's fairly straightforward. But when they're constructing their own asset, their own building, it doesn't meet the definition of an asset until it's ready for its intended use. So all the while it's under construction, it's using the company's resources. Some of the company's resources are going into that building, and so we have to properly account for them. So the two basic areas of complication are interest, which we'll take up in the near future, and overhead, which we'll look at right here. Your direct costs of labor and materials that go into a construction project are fairly easy to determine. The assignment of overhead gets a little bit complicated. So what's our overhead? Just as a quick reminder, that's the utilities, the power, the light, water, heat, insurance, supplies, some factory supervision, your indirect labor, things like that. Now, companies account for it two different ways when they're doing a self-constructed asset. There's the incremental approach and the full costing approach. Incremental, they assign no fixed overhead. Now, if you need to go back and review fixed and variable, now's a good time to do it, but they're assigning no fixed overhead to the self-constructed asset, just variable overhead. Incremental approach, because they're simply assigning the increase in all of their utilities, the increase in all of their overhead to that construction project, okay? The other way to do it is the full costing approach, and here they come up with a percentage of all of their overhead to assign to this particular self-constructed asset. The rationale, if you don't allocate some of that overhead, then you're understating the actual cost of the asset, because those resources, some of them went into the construction of that building. Okay, so most companies are going to use the full costing approach, some will use this. The other little embarrassing item is that you can only bring this building, this self-constructed asset, on the books up to the fair value of the project. In other words, what it would have cost you if you had had an independent contractor do the job. Okay, so say the building ends up costing the company $300,000, but if they had, because they didn't know what they were, maybe they kind of had a few goof ups because they didn't know what they were doing, and so it cost them $300,000. The fair value of the building and the value that what they would have paid an independent contractor to do it was $275,000. They cannot bring that building on at $300,000. They have to bring it on at the fair value of $275,000, and they have to record a loss for that overage. So anyway, that's what you need to know about overhead. I don't think there's any problems on this per se, but from sort of the multiple choice portion, you need to be aware of the concepts involved here. Okay, and our next adventure will be into the much more complicated, dealing with the interest on self-constructed assets.